the independent chair of the inquiry into the Sheffield street trees dispute. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon. Could you please tell us your name and your role?
My name is Rebecca Hammond, and I was co-chair of Sheffield Tree Action Groups for about a year from March 2017.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for coming this afternoon. I really appreciate your coming for this conversation. First thing I just need to say is just to remind you we're recording the discussion and it's being broadcast, and then when we get to the end we will upload it onto the website and people will be able to watch it later if they want to. You know very well that the dispute was a time of quite a lot of stress and emotion and anxiety for many people. When we're having these conversations, we have to be careful that we don't inadvertently say anything that could be defamatory or libelous, or could bring into the public domain information which is private personal data which people have a right to have protected. I'm sure we won't run into that problem, but just to let you know, were I to get concerned about that, I would flag it to you, and in extremis, if the concerns weren't addressed, we might have to pause the hearing, just so you're aware. So we sent you a list of questions. Thank you very much for, I know you will have thought about them in advance, the issues we want to discuss, and we'll work our way through them. But firstly, I would just like to give you a chance to say anything you would like to say by way of introductory remarks.
When Sheffield City Council included a contractual requirement to fell half the city's street trees, that's 17,500 trees, they possibly did not imagine the consequences. Their decision to continue, in the face of expert evidence and ever-increasing opposition, both locally and nationally, was utterly bizarre. Countless people put huge amounts of time and effort into trying to persuade the council to change their course of action. Eventually they were successful, but this came at great expense in the form of physical injuries, mental health problems, criminal records and financial sacrifices. The council spent millions of pounds of public money in legal costs and contractual penalties on pursuing the course of action they had committed to. In the intervening years, we have learned more about how some things came about, but we have still not found out about how the felling target came to be included in the contract and why the council was so very determined to keep it come what may.
Thank you very much. So the first thing I'd like to ask you is if you could tell us how you first became aware of the removal of street trees and the street tree replacement programme, and what your concerns were when you first became aware.
Okay. I first became aware in the summer of 2015 when someone told me about the petition against the felling of trees on Rustlings Road. That led me to find out more about what was going on. I did a bit of research, and that led me to find out about Sheffield Tree Action Groups sometime in the autumn of 2015. And the more I found out, the more I was appalled at the potential scale of the effects of felling on so many street trees, which are a crucial part of the character of the city. They aren't just like lampposts and signposts and other street furniture. They add character, they improve the city. I think the reason I wasn't aware sooner than 2015 was for two reasons. Firstly, there was quite a lot going on in my personal life, and I was very much focused on that. And the tree felling had not yet had an impact on the area where we lived at the time. I was aware of the Streets Ahead contract, but all I knew was that it involved improving the roads, fixing potholes and street lights, that every road was going to be dug up and resurfaced. I certainly didn't hear anything about street trees. In hindsight, it feels like the tree felling target was suppressed publicly.
Okay. So could you tell us, having become aware of the issue and having become aware of groups, how you became involved in the groups and became more informed about what was going on?
Having found out about Stag, I joined the march in the city centre in November 2015, which was the day after the Bataclan incident in Paris. I remember we held a minute's silence for that. At around the same time, a local group formed to campaign for Rivelin Valley Road. At the time, my daily journey to work took me down Rivelin Valley Road every day, and I was appalled at the potential effects of felling so many trees on that avenue, particularly as they were in two quite big blocks near the park and the fire station. So, it wasn't just odd trees here and there, it was long stretches. That local campaign group was initially my focus, and then I became more involved with the citywide campaign over the next few months.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about how groups were formed and organised, and then how the local groups started to collaborate with each other across the city, and how this led to the formation of the Sheffield Tree Action Groups?
So STAG was formed before I got involved. My understanding is that various small groups have sprung up around the city representing residents of certain streets or areas, trying to deal with the proposed fellings in their areas. And someone, I'm not entirely sure who, realised that this was going on and convened a meeting at which STAG was formed to provide an umbrella for those local groups to share information and things, because they'd all been having separate discussions and engagements with the council, and it was realised that some working together would help.
Okay. And then how and with who did the local groups start to raise their concerns in these relatively initial phases? I'm thinking especially of 2013 to 2015. And what do you think people were trying to achieve at that stage?
Okay, so this was really before I got involved, but I believe, I'm told that there were lots of efforts made to try and speak to councillors and council officers. For example, I believe there was a tree walk on Rustlings Road where they went and looked at each of the affected trees. And in 2015, the council convened what was meant to be a bi-monthly Highway Trees Advisory Forum. And certainly at one of those meetings, a fellow campaigner, Calvin Payne, says the council's arguments about why so many trees needed to be felled were just utterly demolished. And he left that meeting feeling like the campaigners had won. There was no way that the council could continue to pursue that course of action in the face of all the evidence and expertise and arguments that had been presented to them. In essence, people wanted the council to revisit the decision to fell so many trees, and this was consistent throughout the campaign, and to use basic highway engineering solutions to repair the roads and pavements without felling the trees. There was plenty of expertise and best practice guidance available explaining how and why to retain street trees, and that's what we wanted them to do. Okay.
And tell us about the response people got to these concerns at that time from the council and Amy and others.
I think the early campaigners thought that they just needed to make the council aware of the problems and best practice, and that then the council would acknowledge the mistake and try to rectify it. But it became apparent that the council were pursuing another agenda and appeared to have no desire to acknowledge that what they were doing was wrong.
Okay. Now I want to ask you about something that played a significant part in the how things played out over the following years, which is the use of freedom of information and subject access requests to find out information about the removal of trees, and how these kinds of techniques, the sort of entitlements people have to seek information, how they became an important activity, I think, for some campaigners, and what kind of topics and what kind of information were people most keen to access through those inquiries?
Okay. The council were just generally unwilling to voluntarily provide information, so people realised that the only way forward seemed to be to use freedom of information requests. It's like getting blood from a stone, but at least FOI was legally enforceable. Even then, the council went to great efforts to refuse FOI requests on various grounds, for example, labelling them vexatious or other grounds. The topics ranged all over the place from, I've lost track, asking financial questions, asking for copies of policies, strategies, evidence, everything. Because it's anything that we wanted to know but we just couldn't get voluntarily from the council.
Okay.
It's very broad-ranging. I submitted several FOIs and other people submitted more than me. And if I may, I'd like to run through the tortuous process of one of the FOI requests that I submitted, because I think it's, although possibly a slightly more extreme example, it is an example of just to what lengths the council seemed to go to try and keep information away. So in February 2016, the council published what they said was version 7 of the Highway Tree Management Strategy. And they used it as evidence in court in the 2016 judicial review, as evidence that the trees were under good management. A year later, in February 2017, I submitted an FOI requesting versions 1 to 6, so the previous versions. Initially, the council refused this request on the grounds that it was commercially sensitive, and that versions 1 to 6 were actually draft versions of the document, not live versions. I immediately requested an internal review as per the FOI process. Because version 7 had been made public, it stood that versions 1 to 6 could be. And also, the version control on the document said that the versions 1 to 6 had been live documents, so they weren't draft, they were live documents. As was pretty typical, the council exceeded the statutory time limits for completing the internal review, and I had to chase them up several times by phone and email. I eventually gave them a deadline by which I would escalate my complaint to the Information Commissioner's office, and I received a response literally at the 11th hour, in which they upheld their original refusal to provide the information. So I then escalated this to the Information Commissioner's office. In responding to that complaint in October 2017, so this is 8 months after my original FOI request, the council said that they did not actually hold copies of versions 1 to 6 of the tree management strategy, and they said that the refusal under other grounds had been a mistake based on the hypothetical supposition that the council actually had copies. I hope you're keeping up. Mm-hmm. In July 2018, so we're now 18 months after the original request, the council then contacted me to say that they had, and I quote, stumbled upon the previous versions of the strategies which were not previously identified, and had published them on their website. Interestingly, this was sent to me on the 16th of July 2018, 4 days after the council had obtained a renewal of their High Court injunction against protesters, which in part of it relied on the version 7 of the tree management strategy. As it turned out, version 7 of the tree management strategy that had been presented to court was substantially different to the version 7 and earlier versions that they released in July 2018. I know you've been presented with information setting out the differences between the original public version 7 and all the other versions. And it seems like the public version of 7 was a fake version cobbled together to serve a purpose for court. This FOI wasn't the only FOI to go through a protracted process of getting blood from a stone. Another FOI which required prolonged escalation via the Information Commissioner was also very insignificant, because it resulted in the council eventually publishing the service specifications from the contract in March 2018. I think that was pursued by Paul Selby. This confirmed that Amy had a contractual obligation to fell 17,500 trees over the duration of the contract. Despite this, the council still maintained that it wasn't a target but was insurance. Julie Dorr, who was then leader of the council, likened it to a mobile phone contract. I then submitted two further FOIs, the first relating to drainage gullies, something fairly uncontroversial, and then the second relating to highway trees. Both asked whether failure to meet the performance requirement would result in a financial penalty to Amy. The answer was essentially yes. So it wasn't insurance, it was a requirement to fell that number of trees. In the same March 2018 publication, that was when we learned that Amy were responsible for dealing with the actions of protesters, which then raised the question of why the council had taken it upon themselves to take out the injunction and seek committal to prison of people who they thought had broken the injunction, and why it wasn't Amy that was doing that.
Okay, thank you very much. So you've raised quite a lot of issues there, which we are looking at, and which I'm not going to pursue the content of with you now, but you've used that as a way of illustrating essentially the way, from your point of view, the FOI process was working, and essentially, my next question is, well, to what extent were you satisfied with the way that process was working? And what were the consequences of whether you were or weren't satisfied with it?
Specifically with the...
Well, with the general handling of FOI requests. I'm not asking about particular cases now.
The general handling of FOI requests was obstructive, slow. Again, it was just an attempt to hide information, so they wriggled out of it every way they could.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is you were unsatisfied with the response. And so my question now is, so in the light of being unsatisfied with the response of trying to get information, work out what was going on, how did discussions among campaigners then evolve? And how did it come about that people then started to consider other options, including what we saw was the emergence of non-violent direct action and also legal action. And if you're in the picture on this, maybe you can tell us a bit about the process by which campaigners decided to take legal action.
So firstly, I think probably the increasing use of FOIs came after the initial decision to take legal action. There were lots of things going on along in parallel, and my recollection is that people hadn't really sort of twigged onto the FOI process at that point. I was not involved in the decision to seek a judicial review, because at that point I was still very much on the edge of the campaign. I do know that non-violent direct action did start to be discussed in 2016, and we had some workshops with someone who had experience of NVDA, so that we could all get a bit more comfortable with the idea, because for a lot of us it was a massive step out of our comfort zone. This was a whole bunch of law-abiding citizens who previously thought that the way to protest was sign petitions and write letters, and then the idea of stepping over barriers or whatever was quite a big step.
Okay. And now you've just said you weren't closely involved in this, and I will be asking other people this, but is there anything else you want to say about what people hope to achieve through the 2016 judicial review process, and what they thought of how it went, and how people reacted to the outcome, and how people thought the council would react?
Yeah. So I did ask Anna Maria Carusi, who was heavily involved in developing the idea of seeking the judicial review, and played a big role in developing the case. She summarised for me that aside from wanting to halt the tree felling, they wanted the council to do a full environmental assessment of the impact of the tree felling, and also a proper public consultation. They knew that the need for an environmental impact assessment might be thrown out on a technicality, but that the stronger point was about the quality of the public consultation. And their assessment of the evidence presented by the council to court was that there were many inaccuracies and potentially even lies. The most egregious of which Anna Maria felt was that was the street trees strategy, version 7 that I've already discussed. That what seemed, I gather, was kind of a key part of the council's case. The council knew that they had signed a contract with Amy which stipulated the number of trees to be felled, and they appear to have withheld this from the court. There was general disappointment and frustration, especially as in the light of the feelings about the evidence that the council had presented, and there was a feeling that the judge didn't give sufficient weight to the evidence that had been presented by campaigners. And the council basically reacted by declaring a victory. I seem to remember the phrase, something like they called it a mandate for the tree felling. They thought that was it. They thought they'd won. Although there was great disappointment at the failure of the judicial review, in one respect it was very successful, because whilst he was considering the case, the judge granted an interim injunction preventing the council from felling any trees unless there was an urgent emergency need to do so. And that lasted several months and therefore saved a large number of trees. And then at the end of that time, we were then into bird nesting season, which again saved a lot of trees. So it didn't stop everything, but I'm sure it's one of many instances where there are trees still standing today because of that action.
Okay, I see. Thank you. So I want to move on to another issue now, which is to ask if you have any views that you want to share with us about the independent tree panel.
It was quite obviously a sham. There was another attempt to say that they'd consulted the public, but the surveys were delivered to households in plain brown envelopes addressed to the occupier and very easily ignored and thrown away with the junk mail. They had nothing on them to indicate that they'd come from the council or might be remotely important. When we did door-to-door surveys of residents, asking whether they'd received the surveys, unsurprisingly, many people didn't recall receiving the survey. For example, on Balmain Road, the council only received 4 responses from 59 households. We managed to survey 36 of those households, and 19 of them said they hadn't received a survey. 21 households, 58%, said they disagreed with our respondents said they disagreed with the felling. 7 households said that they had responded to the survey, but the council apparently only received 4 responses. So none of that added up. We tried to bring this to the attention of the local councillors for Hillsborough at the time, and also Paul Billington, the council officer who was in charge. I didn't get any reply from the councillors, and Paul Billington replied to say that the council's results were clear and conclusive, and that the council cannot respond to ad hoc surveys conducted for and by special interest groups. Later, Emeritus Professor Greg Brooks of Sheffield University wrote a critique of the household survey and described its methodology and the conclusions inferred from it as a denial of democracy. And then from the household survey, that led to the independent tree panel. But even when the independent tree panel advised retaining trees, the council had ignored that advice for 237 out of 312 trees. And the council instead went with what Amy said. The council never disagreed with Amy. According to the council, the delays introduced by the independent tree panel process apparently cost over £1 million in contract penalties to the council, which seems an awful lot of money to spend on a sham exercise, and it just adds to my overall impression that the council were trying to cover something up.
Okay. So I want to move on now to another issue, one of the best known issues during the course of the dispute, which is what happened on Roslings Road in November 2016, and invite you to tell us your views on what happened, including the role played, anything you want to tell us about the role played by the council, Amy, the police and others.
Like many people, I was just appalled by the whole operation. It was a night raid. It started in the early hours of the morning before dawn. They brought the police in, arrested pensioners who were standing in the street in a last-ditch attempt to save the trees. It later emerged that the council had told the police that the trees were dangerous or diseased, which was not true. That day I had to go to work, but I was trying to follow events, and I remember I phoned into Radio Sheffield. I was crouched behind the bins at work trying to stay out of the wind, and I was absolutely fuming, in part because just the day before they'd been reporting about how residents in the Firth Park area of the city had been asking the police to deal with antisocial behaviour, and then the next morning there were all these police on Rustlings Road for felling a few trees that did not need to be felled. And some people even reported seeing the police dog van parked round the corner. They'd already arrested Calvin Payne and Simon Crump 2 weeks previously on Marden Road, and that was also clearly a very pre-planned arrest, because the felling crew who turned up knew that someone was going to be arrested, and on what grounds. I think the council hoped that would stop the protests and stop people standing under trees, and it didn't work. And the Rustlings Road night raid was simply the next step in the council's escalating attempts to intimidate campaigners and try and make us too scared to do anything.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about the effect of the events on Rustlings Road that day on people who were campaigning against the tree removal and replacement programme under the contract?
I think for some people who lived on that road or were closely involved in the campaign on that road, the events were so traumatic that they basically had to step back from the campaign. Some people are still suffering the ongoing effects of that trauma. It made them so ill that they simply haven't recovered, I don't think. On the other hand, it stirred many people into action who had previously just been watching from the sidelines. Membership of the Stag Facebook group grew exponentially. I think we went from 1,000 to 2,000 members within the space of a week or so, and we kept growing and growing and growing. I can't remember the exact figures, but it was just an exponential growth. It triggered people into action who had previously accepted the council's narrative that the tree felling was necessary. They then saw the events on Rustlings Road and realised that the reality must be something different. And it shook their trust in the council as it shook mine. It became clear, if it hadn't been before, that the council were going to plough on with their plan to fell the trees. The well-presented evidence and arguments were being utterly ignored. And it also became clear at that point that the only way to protect trees was going to be to stand under them and get in the way. It was Rustlings Road where people first realised that you could protect a tree by standing in the garden that was overhung by the tree, because that was private property, for example. So that's when people started to become more inventive, and with more minds thinking about these things, people were more inventive. So even though people had been arrested, more people became willing to do more things.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier the petition in relation to the Rivelin Valley Road trees.
Yeah.
And I understand that you presented a petition to the council at the full meeting of the council in February 2017. So I wanted to ask you to tell us about that. What led particularly to that petition, how signatures were gathered, and your reflections on the debate in the council that day.
So it was one of a number of fairly similar petitions relating to trees in different areas of the city, and like all of them, we collected signatures online and in person. Each petition, if we got 5,000 signatures from Sheffield residents, meant we could then trigger a debate in full council. It became another opportunity to try and present information to the full council. So petitions were collected online and in person. Some hardy souls spent hours on end, stood out in the street in Hillsborough collecting signatures. In the end, we had signatures from every postcode in the city. So it wasn't just local people in that area of the city who were bothered about this issue. It was very much of wider interest. Presenting the petition was my first experience of any council meeting, and it was deeply disappointing. And the day after the meeting, I think to try and get my thoughts together, I wrote a piece about what it had been like. And in that I said, the posturing, bullying, disrespect and failure to listen and downright disregard for the best interests of the people of Sheffield was astounding. I recall that members of the public were treated with derision by councillors from the ruling Labour group. Public questions weren't properly answered, and the debate about the petition was basically a display of tribalism by the Labour councillors. And actually that didn't just extend to the tree petition, but also to another petition that had triggered a debate about the closure of Hurlfield's View, which was the last remaining specialist dementia respite facility in the city. There was a similar display for the people presenting that petition, many of whom were, family members of people with advanced dementia who were desperate. At the end of my reflective piece, I wrote, I was left wondering why it is that our Labour Council refused to accept that there might be something wrong with the contract. Why won't they admit that it's faulty and at least try to make it better, even if the options are limited? What are they trying to hide?
Okay, thank you. Now, in 2017, as you know, the council took out an injunction against campaigners and protesters, and I wanted to ask your reaction to that decision, but also how the actions of people opposing the council evolved in the light of the injunction and in the light of the related matters such as, the undertakings, for example.
Well, sort of moving on from Rustlings Road, the next crunch point was Chipping House Road in February 2017, when 9 people were arrested that week, including 7 in one go. And then that came to an end when barrister Paul Halsland presented his legal opinion and basically advised that the police could not arrest people under the Trades Union and Labour Relations Act. So the police stopped arresting people. And that then meant that we could all go off and prevent fellings very effectively. As long as you got inside the barriers before they started felling, or even when they had started felling, you could carefully not be under the falling branches, they would stop felling. So people became more confident. And then the situation developed in May 2017. So Amy brought in extra felling crews. So as well as from Acorn Environmental Group were subcontracting, but using crews from Sheffield, and then they brought in extra crews from Southampton and Redditch and possibly somewhere else, I think. And that first week, the first week that it occurred in May 2017, we called it Treemageddon. So there were 10 felling crews buzzing around the city, trying to overwhelm us, basically. And initially they did, and they got a few trees down. But very quickly, campaigners organised themselves to keep track of the crews, send out alerts, get people to the felling sites. And all this happened organically. No single person organised it, no one was in charge. It was very successful. And that was the time when the council and Amy then started collecting the details of people who were obstructing fellings, getting photos, getting people's names and things, recording our vehicle registration numbers and things. And that evidence then started to be used. It then became clear that evidence was being used to develop the case for the injunction. So the injunction was yet another escalation in the council's attempt to intimidate us and squash the protests, having failed in other respects. First of all, they issued undertakings to 17 people, most of whom signed simply because they could not afford the financial risk associated with defending the injunction. They couldn't afford to risk losing their homes or businesses and being unable to support their families. I was one of those 17 people, but I did not know that until 4 days before court proceedings started, when I was listed as one of the people who had not signed the undertaking by the deadline. And that was because they had actually put it through the wrong letterbox of our old house that we had left 2 years previously. Bearing in mind, I'm the one that pays the council tax, so they had my details. So I did not have chance to seek a lot of legal advice, and the advice that I did receive was based on the limited information that the council had revealed about the contract in public, and on that basis I didn't feel I could defend the injunction, so I signed the undertaking. As it turned out, the terms of the undertaking were stricter than the final court injunction, so there were a number of us that for the next year were bound by stricter terms than the public at large. Again, I think the council misled the court as to the nature of the contractual performance requirement, stipulating the 17,500 tree target. The judge gave credence to council officers and did not ask to see the contract. And again, it's also bizarre that the council pursued this legal action when the contract clearly stated that Amy were responsible for dealing with protester action. This still puzzles me. Once the injunction was in place in August 2017, I think that once again the council thought they had won. I recall a meeting with Paul Billington at some point between the granting of the injunction and it coming into force, where he made a point of showing us his copy of it and sort of saying, well, we've got this now. And he thought that was it. But once again, the council weren't prepared for the inventiveness or determination of people to stand up to them and protect the city's trees. So people closely examined the terms of the injunction, worked out what was not allowed, but also what was allowed on it. And it was just another example of every time the council upped the ante, people would come up with ways to oppose them and slow down the fellings in new ways. And whilst many people did feel that their actions were restricted by the injunction, other people, new people, would step in and sort of take up the baton. I recently refound a rather threatening email that was sent to Chris Rust and I from the council, saying that if, as co-chairs, we did not unequivocally condemn a breach of the injunction that had occurred, it would be regarded as support for the unlawful activities. I think they were trying to get us for breaching the injunction. But this was typical of the increasingly hard and intimidatory tone that was being adopted by certain council officers in dealing with us. They thought they caught us out, and I think they thought that if they could get us under the injunction, they would somehow cut the head off Stag or something, which was quite clearly wrong, and we'd all go away. Our response was that we had both signed undertakings, we had not breached them, and we had no control over what anyone else did. So.
Okay. Do you have that email?
I do.
Would that be something you would be willing to give us?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that response. Okay. Can I move on now to ask you whether there were things that the campaigners did during the course of 2017 to try to end the dispute?
As ever, we repeatedly expressed, both in public and directly to council officers, that we wanted to talk about the issues and have a sensible discussion. And at the same time, people kept the pressure on the street by obstructing the fellings in whatever way they felt able to do. And alongside this, other people were exploring other avenues, for example, liaising with central government and looking into the options for legal challenges. So there was sort of three-pronged approach.
Okay. So I was also going to ask you how you, during the course of 2017 or other times, tried to draw other people, including central government, into sort of help make the argument you were making.
Yeah. So early on in the campaign, campaigners from Save Our Rustling Street and other groups managed to make contact and build links with, for example, various arboricultural experts who were really helpful, including people like Jeremy Barrell, who is widely respected in the art world, and Russell Horsey, who is former chair of the Institute of Chartered Foresters. So people who with weight in the arboricultural world. They provided valuable advice about the realities of tree care and maintenance and things. We did also make links with highways engineers and people who provided advice from that aspect of things. One of our campaigners is an experienced civil servant, and he used his knowledge and connections to make contact with DEFRA and then the Department of Communities and Local Government. And part of the consequence of that was that Michael Gove came to the city when he was Environment Secretary, and there's the famous bonkers quote. He declared it to be bonkers. Alongside this, Chris and I sent a very detailed letter to the Secretary of State, Sajid Javid at the time, to place a citywide tree preservation order on all the highway trees.
He just for clarity, he was the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government.
He was, yes, I think so. But he was the one that within the legislation there was a facility for the Secretary of State to impose a TPO. Right. So that's why we directed it to him. He was the one that could have done that. Okay. But that was via DEFRA.
Right.
And that request was considered seriously by DCLG, but in the end not actioned due to practical obstacles. And I don't know whether part of that was the contract funding or what. But yeah.
Okay. Now, following the...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, please go on, Rebecca.
Yeah. We also developed a very effective media strategy. We managed to foster good relations with various journalists, particularly from the Yorkshire Post on a regional level and The Guardian. And news stories from those outlets were often then picked up by other news organisations and also syndicated to other papers. So we got national coverage. It became a bit of a running joke that in February 2018, Brian Lodge, who was then the cabinet member responsible, said, "People in Southampton are not talking about Sheffield trees." On the same day that the Southampton Daily Echo had the story, "Protesters against controversial plans to cut down trees in Sheffield have occupied the council chamber." So Southampton became a bit of a running joke.
I see. Okay. As you know, later in 2017, having taken out the injunction, or been granted the injunction, the council decided to pursue committal proceedings late in 2017 and in 2018, in fact, against people who they alleged had breached the injunction. And I wanted to ask if you could describe for us how campaigners and protesters evolved their approach in the light of that.
Well, it was yet another attempt by the council to squash the campaign by making people be too scared to obstruct the tree felling in any way. It was yet again upping the ante. But they were seeking the committal to prison of people who they alleged had breached the injunction. But it just seemed to have the opposite effect, and people got more and more determined to oppose the council. Also, along the way, all these various, defending the injunction in the first place, and then defending the allegations of injunction breaches and paying fines to the council. There was a lot of crowdfunding went on. People contributed what they could. Several people made quite substantial loans to the campaign, so that we had enough money to defend the injunction and provide the support that people needed when they were alleged to have breached it. And those loans meant that action could take place, and they knew that there was the possibility that they might not get it back. In the end, we did manage to pay back everyone who had made these quite substantial loans. But that was a significant commitment by some people.
Okay. Can you describe for us how the dispute then escalated further from late 2017 to early 2018, and your perspective on how campaigners and protesters essentially responded or reacted to changes in how the council and Amy were handling opposition on the streets, and also the evolving role of the police.
Yeah. So people basically got more inventive and determined in how they were going to protect the trees. I have no idea how many people were regularly disguising their identities and going to great lengths to get into safety zones. At the time, I suspected the identities of 1 or 2 people. I know a few more now, but I think there are others that I will never know who they were. They were faced with Amy barrier crews, security guards and police officers. It got increasingly dangerous for them as the security guards were being very rough when they ejected protesters from the barriers. There were injuries sustained by protesters, and pain was inflicted. There were claims that one security guard had sustained a broken wrist, but this was never evidenced, but much was made of it by the council and the police in justifying the police involvement. The police always seemed to be very quick to act on allegations against protesters. There were lots of arrests and de-arrests and things, but they routinely ignored complaints made by protesters about the security guards, even when the police were quite obviously observing an incident occurring in front of them. They just didn't even acknowledge that anything had happened. Christine King got had sort of collapsed underneath a tree, and as the security guards were carrying another protester out, one of them managed to kick her in the head with a steel-toe cap boot. The police refused to take any sort of a report from her on the scene and said that she would have to go to a police station to do that. She ended up being taken to hospital to be checked out because of the head injury. When the security guards first came on the scene in late November 2017, they're supposed to wear their SIA licences, their sort of ID badge, usually on the upper arm as the most obvious place. You'll see bouncers outside nightclubs doing that. And they weren't wearing them. And one of our campaigners knew the rules because she runs pubs and she knows what the rules are. So then we started saying, well, we need to see your SIA licence. So then they were wearing them but covering up, obscuring most of the content of it. Or I once went along the road and asked to see them, and they were sort of in the armpit rather than the outside, and if you asked to see it, they would sort of flash it like that. Could be anything. This was obviously a deliberate attempt to hide the identities of the security guards. Again, another one of our supporters, who is an SIA licensed security worker, said that the firm she worked for had declined the contract when Amy informed them that they would be asking them to hide their SIA licenses.
Okay, thank you. In March 2018, there was a pause in the tree removals, the fellings and tree replacements. Do you have a view or a hypothesis about what the key factors were which led to the council to announce the pause?
I think at that time there were a couple of factors at play. Firstly, and probably the most significant, and this is just my hypothesis, is that it was taking a felling crew, the whole day to fell half a tree, when they should have been able to take down 3 trees in that time. Plus there were the costs of all the extra barrier crew, security guards, etc. And I guessed that someone in Amy was repeatedly redoing the maths, the financial calculations, and came to the conclusion that they would just be better off taking the hits on the contractual penalties, rather than continuing to pay out for all these extra resources. There came a point when the balance swung the other way and it wasn't worth it anymore. The second aspect was that the media coverage was snowballing. In the last couple of weeks before the pause, we were in the national newspapers virtually every day, different papers every day. Media across the spectrum were covering the story, universally supportive of the campaigners and critical of the council, from the Guardian to the Times and everything in between. And then, after the March 2018 pause, the following month came the news that the Forestry Commission were investigating the legality of the fellings. So I guess they couldn't really restart felling at that point when there was an investigation ongoing.
Okay.
So that was the final nail in that coffin.
I see. That's your perspective on that. Okay. You touched on the fact that people suffered various harms through the course of the dispute. Would you like to say anything more about who suffered what harms and the impact the dispute has had on people, including, if you, I mean, it's up to you, there's no need for you to tell us that, but if there's anything you want to tell us about the impact on you?
I think lots of people suffered harms. On a general level, I know that many people have experienced mental health difficulties as a result of the council's actions, with people describing depression, anxiety and symptoms of PTSD which persist to this day. I think many of us are still triggered by the sound of a chainsaw.
Right.
And if you see an orange chipper coming along the road, towed by a blue truck that might be Acorn, your heart starts racing.
Mm-hmm.
The anxiety is still there, and this is 4.5 years after it finished.
Right.
People also, I think, suffered physical health problems related to long days standing around on cold streets in a stressful environment. Some people ended up really quite unwell. On a personal level, the whole experience was highly stressful. I was dedicating a lot of time to the campaign, whilst also trying to manage a full-time job. When they threatened legal action if I did not sign the undertaking, they threatened my financial security and my home. If they had taken legal action against me, I could have lost my professional registration and consequently my job. And as the major wage earner in our house at the time, that would have been quite devastating.
Yeah.
For a while I suffered with depression. I think it had its origins before my involvement in the campaign, but I am absolutely certain that the situation with the actions of the council exacerbated it and prolonged it.
Okay.
I'm absolutely certain of that. And it also put a tremendous strain on my marriage, which has basically taken another 4 years to repair.
Right.
I am sure that the emotional stress of working in those conditions with lots of protesters around and lots of argy-bargy and things will have also affected some of the Acorn and Amy workers. Anderson's tree crews were also involved earlier on, but stopped being involved when it really got more heated. And some of those workers were occasionally nice enough to sort of try and apologise for what was going on. They were obviously uncomfortable. On the other hand, some crews, some individuals seemed to enjoy it and made it personal. But yeah, others were more reticent. On a wider level, the city has suffered a reputational damage which will take time to repair. And many people have simply lost their trust in the council. Like many people, I used to think that elected councillors and council officers would make decisions in good faith, doing the best that they could within the confines of the shrinking budget available to them. I am now deeply sceptical about anything the council says or does, and I question their motives all the time, because I simply do not trust that they are necessarily making decisions in the best interests of the city.
Okay, thank you very much for your response to that. So let me ask you, from what you know now, why do you think the dispute arose in the first place? In other words, why did the council adopt an approach which attracted the opposition that it did?
I've thought about this a lot, and I have never come to any sort of conclusion in my mind. I do think it comes down to the fundamental question of why did the contract include the requirement to fell and replace half the city's street trees? I think if you could answer that, then you would get to it. But I've never managed to work that particular bit out for myself. I have always suspected that it originates in the Elliott Consultancy survey of 2006-07, when they surveyed all the city street trees, assessed their condition and their age. At that time, they made the recommendation that about 1,000 trees needed removing. A further 9,000 needed some form of remedial work, mostly pruning. The report also classified the trees according to age and noted that 74% of trees were mature, basically highlighting that a lot of the city's tree stock was at the older end of the spectrum, and there was a gap at the younger end that needed filling by planting new trees, not chopping down the old ones. The report certainly did not make the recommendation to chop down a load of old trees. And the term mature means that a tree is of an age, it's really a forestry term that means that the tree is of an age and size where it's worth felling it. And when it gets over mature, that means there's no point leaving it in the ground anymore. You're not going to get any more out of it. So saying the trees were mature just meant they were adult trees. It's like saying that you were right, we're adults. Doesn't mean that we're over the hill and about to keel over. In the urban context, that forestry term is irrelevant. A mature tree can live for a long, long time, still providing useful benefits for the area, and it's fine. Okay. So it's my belief that the results of the Elliott survey were used in some way to inform the content of the contract. But whether it was a genuine misunderstanding or a deliberate misuse of the survey, I cannot say. What it does appear is that once the council had set off down this road, they chose not to revisit. It felt like they were always trying to defend and justify something which they knew was wrong, but they didn't want to admit it. Again, whether this was because they were trying to cover up for a monumental mistake or a deliberate decision, I cannot say. I really hope that councillors and council officers will be able to answer that for you. But I am aware that several key figures who were involved in the genesis and implementation of the contract have either retired or moved on to roles in other organisations. But there are still people around who I would hope know the answer to that question. Okay. We've heard representatives from the council say that they believe the issue was one of poor communication and groupthink. I think this hugely downplays the issues. Saying the same thing more slowly and more loudly doesn't help improve people's understanding of a fundamentally flawed approach.
Okay. Okay, thank you. As you know, we are looking at the answer to the question I've asked you, and we'll do our best to provide an answer to it through the inquiry. So then it sort of follows, I'm also interested to know why, again, with the benefit of hindsight from what you know now, why you think it took as long as it did to resolve the dispute?
Basically because the council were stubborn and entrenched in their position. And I refer you back to my answer to the previous question.
Yeah.
They weren't willing to acknowledge a mistake. I think they were trying to cover it up rather than admit it. I would like to know how and why the decisions were made to escalate the situation at the various points when they did, rather than take up the offer that was repeatedly made to talk about it and fix it. I do understand that the contract is complicated, but I have also noted that the contract had been altered once in 2016, and after that date we repeatedly heard that it was not possible to alter the contract, which clearly wasn't true. So basically the council's unwillingness.
Okay. You said at the beginning of our conversation today that this is now a long time ago, but I wonder if you still have outstanding concerns or remaining concerns that you want to mention to me.
Well, I've obviously expressed my concern about really getting to the bottom of why the target was included in the contract in the first place. I am also really concerned that the representatives of the council are still pursuing this line that the main issue is a lack of communication with the public. I don't think they have understood or taken on board the need for transparency and honesty, and to actually engage and involve the public in creating these things in the first place. I share Christine King's concerns that the trees will never be truly valued as community assets, that they will always come second to straight curbs and seen as getting in the way of maintaining the roads, rather than being recognised for how they enhance our streets. So although there is, the city has an excellent tree strategy, I feel like behind it there is still some reluctance to actually really acknowledge the value of street trees.
Okay. As you know, in my terms of reference, I said I would try to help identify and implicitly mitigate against the risks of any re-emergence of problems in the future. Do you see risk of that, and beyond what you've just said just now, which touches on it? And what do you think would need to be done to mitigate those risks?
Like I said, basically if the council, both individuals and the corporate body, don't recognise and admit the problems, then they will never take meaningful action to change. There needs to be a big culture shift. I think we saw some of that in the response to the Sheffield governance petition that was organised by It's Our City. The fact that they clearly didn't read the room and hold the referendum voluntarily. They had to be forced to hold that referendum after 5% of the city's residents had signed a petition to trigger the referendum. I think it indicates a continuing culture that needs to change. During the campaign, I experienced just how much energy and expertise there is out there. There are a lot of highly intelligent people in Sheffield with skills that could and should be used by the council, and they should be using that in their decision-making processes rather than just adopting the we know best attitude, which we've seen so far. People recognise that the council is working in significantly straitened financial circumstances. They want the council to make good decisions for the city, and I think they would be willing to help if the council asked for help.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. We got to the end of my rather long list of questions for you. Thank you so much for the amount of thought you've given to your answers and the preparation, and giving us a very clear understanding of what all this felt like to you and your perspective on it. So I'm really grateful to you. Is there anything else you would like to tell us before we close the hearing?
Well, firstly, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and talk about this. Actually, answering these questions has been really useful for me in getting some things straight in my mind, and as a result of preparing my answers, I was going back through old documents and things, and I've got stuff that I want to send you. I think we've covered most things in the questions, but I would also like to add something positive. That as a result of the campaign to save the city street trees, myriad people from diverse backgrounds and political views came together to work for a common cause. It was a massive community effort, and there were incredible acts of kindness, bravery and camaraderie. And as a result of the campaign, I now know many more people than I used to in Sheffield, and I made some really good friends. So that is something positive that's come out of it, and I would like that to be acknowledged. Also, trying to inject a bit of humour into it, in February 2013, the Sheffield Star ran a piece about how the city's street trees were going to be improved. It featured a photo of Jack Scott, who was the responsible cabinet member at the time, and the story said that residents are also being encouraged to become tree champions, to look after species in their neighbourhoods and report any problems. I think it's fair to say that the council got rather more than they bargained for there.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much indeed again, and I think that concludes the hearing now. So Charles, thank you. You can